The African American Legend series highlights the accomplishments of blacks in areas as varied as politics, sports, aviation, business, literature, and religion. We'll explore how African Americans have succeeded in areas where they'd been previously excluded because of segregation, racism, and lack of opportunity. I'm your host, Dr. Roscoe C. Brown, Jr., and with us today is the sports editor of the New York Amsterdam News, Howie Evans. Glad to talk with you again, Howie.
Glad to be back, Dr.
Now
Brown.
tell me, how many years have you been a sports editor of the Amsterdam News?
I really stopped counting, and I couldn't give you a possible accurate account.
Take a guess.
When I started, I'd say about 25 years.
That's interesting.
But I was there many years before.
Well, that's one of the great epochs of sport in America the past 25 years. Of course, you were alive, but you missed the Jackie Robinson era and those eras where they were really breaking barriers. But the Amsterdam News, remember Joe Bostic and some of those folks were really responsible for helping to bring Jackie and the black players to the fore. So now we have a situation where there are many more African American sports writers, sports journalists. And the question that I'm interested in, a lot of people are interested in, what are the major challenges that African American sports journalists face?
Well, of course, it depends on the publication they're working for, whether it's African American publication, whether it's mainstream, what they like to call mainstream newspaper or magazine, whatever. But let's look at writers who are now working with black newspapers. The problems that they encounter, and which I've fought for many years, is credibility. When I started working at the Amsterdam News, we didn't have credentials to anything. I mean, to nothing. And I can recall a good friend of ours, whose name we won't mention, when I asked him about, let me go down and cover the Knicks one time. This is when I first started, and he finally agreed. So he left me an envelope, and I thought it was a press pass. When I got down to the garden, it was a ticket. So I said, well, this is a mistake. But what I learned is that all these years, he had been getting a ticket to sit in the stands to so-called cover the game. Well, I was furious then because that was at the height of my rage of activism. So I 2 weeks later, I made a journey down to Madison Square Garden to talk with the owners and so forth, and the general managers and the press people. And they were flat out, well, this is the best we can do and so forth. Well, I didn't end there. I went to the NBA office and had a meeting with the commissioner. And as a result, they ordered the Knickerbockers to give me a credential. The interesting thing about that is, at that time, there weren't any black writers at black newspapers because all of the black sports writers in the 60s were all working at black newspapers for the most part. And I was a little boy and a real youngster when Jackie Robinson was playing, but I vividly remember, going to see him play many times, and I recall the fight that Joe Bostic and Sam Lacey and Wendell Smith took to integrate baseball. Yeah, Jackie Robinson didn't integrate baseball; the black newspapers did.
Yeah, for the audience, Sam Lacey worked with the Afro-American out of Washington and Baltimore. And Wendell Smith worked for the Pittsburgh Courier, which had a national circulation. And Joe Bostic worked for the Amsterdam News.
And the New York Age.
And the, what was that other paper?
New York Age.
New York Age, that's
Yes.
exactly right. Now, at that time, there were no blacks in Major League Baseball, and they kept writing stories, particularly during World War II, about why aren't they giving the black players a chance to play when many of the white players went into the service and the black players were better anyway. And they arranged a tryout for Jackie and some of the other black players. And as we know, Jackie wasn't necessarily the best player with baseball skills, but he had the best way of dealing with people, great aggressiveness. And at that time, they decided that eventually they'd give somebody a chance. And they gave Jackie the chance, and of course, from then on, we know what happened. But right after Jackie was in Major League Baseball, they used to have Sam Lacey and Wendell Smith and Billy Rowe travel with him, because the black players could not stay with the white players. They would stay in people's houses or in black hotels. Now, that was some 60-odd years ago, and people, African Americans, white Americans, don't realize just how far we have come. Not that we don't have a long way to go, but how far we've come. And what you're describing is those times when black newspapers could not really cover blacks who were in major sporting events, whether it's the Olympics or baseball or whatever. They would literally have to buy a ticket and go to the game.
That's exactly what happened. I started covering the New York Jets in 1964, and in 1965, I was the only African American traveling and covering a professional football
That means the
team.
paper was paying you to travel. At least they recognized the need there.
Yeah, and the Jets had a charter, and they kind of helped us out, because then all the teams chartered, and the players, the writers would travel with the team.
Well, isn't that kind of contaminating your writing, because you get to be friends with the players on the plane?
Well, you have to remember now, in 1965, there weren't that many black players. I think the Jets in 1965 may have had like six players. And I distinctly remember the first time I went up to Peekskill to cover the training camp, and I had played football. So when I started walking, I remember I had to walk up this hill to get to the camp, and all the black players looked at me like I'm a defensive back, because they know you weren't playing any other position then, you know. But
that's interesting. You reported up. They weren't playing any other position at that time. That has to do with the role stereotypes that blacks are put into, whether it's in business or in music or in sports. At that time, blacks could be defensive backs. They couldn't be quarterbacks. They couldn't be middle linebackers. They might be a running back. But now you see the NFL, of course, 75% people of color.
Well, the NFL on Sunday looks like a black college football game.
That's right, yeah.
You know, but in 1969, when we were talking about the sports writing, when the Jets went to the Super Bowl, I was the only black reporter covering the Super Bowl. And I was in a sea of faces that were not like mine. But growing up in New York and playing basketball and all the sports in New York in high school and so forth, being around white people didn't bother me at all. You know, and I never looked upon it, well, you know, I said, well, hey, there's no other black guys here or anything like
that.
It's
the Jackie Robinson syndrome. That's one of the reasons why Ricky chose Jackie. He'd competed against whites. He knew how.
Yeah, but one of the things that I immediately did after that 1969 Super Bowl, I was determined to wage a campaign to get black sports writers into the mainstream of journalism. I wrote a lot of stories which made me an enemy of the media, of the establishment, and which of course meant that many times I wasn't even going to get any jobs with the media, because I was considered that rebel guy over that black newspaper, the Amsterdam News, which was okay with me, because when I began seeing the fruits of what I had done, made me feel very, very good, you know, about it. And to go into venues now, you go into the World Series. I was at the, you know, it's still not a representative, as I feel, a representative group of black writers, because it's like a core group of black writers now, and all. But we graduated from being high school reporters to covering some teams and to being columnists. Now, the columnist was the last barrier, because that meant, of course, as you know, that you could talk about white people. You could talk about racism. You could talk about all of these things as a columnist, which you couldn't talk about as a guy who's covering a team. So when we started getting a few columnists, Brian Burwell was working at USA Today, and then Michael Wilbon, and so forth, and Bill Rhoden
over the
Bill
Times.
Rhoden became a columnist at the Times. So, yes, times have changed, but they haven't really changed a heck of a lot in terms of positions where a black sports writer can really and freely speak his mind. And people don't understand that. They see black guys writing stories in the paper and say, oh, this guy ain't saying nothing. Well, he can't say anything because he's not a columnist. He has to report on what happened in the game without giving an opinion and all. So that is one of the barriers that we broke, and we're still breaking that barrier and still fighting that war of having black sports writers into mainstream media and all.
Of course, this is the dilemma of blacks in America. We talk about this one country, but because of the identification of race, we are treated differently in almost every field. Some of us are fortunate enough to be integrated into the larger society and be stars and well-respected like Oprah Winfrey. But the fact is that there's still some role stereotyping around blacks. Now, speaking of that, what are the major problems that are reflected in the way in which black athletes are reported in the media, either by white writers or black writers? What about some of those images of black athletes in the media? How are they created? Are they positive? Are they negative? What can we do to change them?
Well, let's frame your first question, the image. There are two things now that are on the breakfast table of every household in this country, and that's drugs, steroids, and with those two, black athletes always take the major hit. Let's talk about the steroids. Barry Bonds has become the whipping boy. Now, all of the athletes, they say, and which Major League Baseball and other people doing this count, said at least 80% of Major League Baseball players have taken steroids. But yet, when they start talking about it, they only talk about one person, Barry Bonds. Although Jason Giambi has come out of the news, they no longer, when they write something about him, they no longer mention his steroid problem. There was the player, and I can't recall his name.
Mark
McGuire. Well, Mark McGuire, but the other guy who came out and admitted.
Jose Canseco.
Well, yeah, but Jose wrote the book. But there was a guy who came out like about 6 or 7 months ago and admitted that he'd been taking steroids. Well, he was in and out of the news just like that, 2 or 3 days. We saw it with the case of Wayne, the hockey player, Wayne Gretzky. Wayne Gretzky. He was caught up in this gambling thing with his wife. His wife admitted taking bets and betting and so forth. He was taken right out of the newspapers and all. And everybody said, well, whatever happened to that?
Do you think it's purposeful that they focus on the black athlete, or is it a function of the culture in this country where blacks are not expected to be as good as whites?
No, it's very much deliberate. It is tremendously
why is it deliberate?
Because, first of all, we have reached a stage now where the black athlete is a much envied individual. But at the same time, there's a tremendous amount of jealousy and so forth, because without question, athletes of color around the world are the greatest athletes in the world. Soccer, you know, I mean, you can go down Ronaldo, Pele, some of the greatest athletes. Baseball, basketball, you know, some of the greatest athletes. So what you have is, especially in basketball, where these athletes are making tremendous sums of money, and all they want to do is talk about the money. You never ever read a story about Michael Jordan unless they talk about how much money he made or he's making. And you never read a story about Shaquille O'Neal without them putting his salary somewhere in the story and all. All the years in baseball, and I remember this vividly, that Joe DiMaggio and Ted Williams and some of the great stars of the 50s and 40s, you never ever knew how much those guys made.
Well, you did know,
taboo.
because the one joke about Babe Ruth, when he was making $80,000 back in the Depression, and some reporter said, well, you're making more money than the president. Yeah. And Babe Ruth reportedly said he didn't have as good a year as I had.
Yeah, but that was like a joke.
Yeah.
You know, and it wasn't until Wilt Chamberlain cracked the $100,000 barrier that all of a sudden, here's this Goliath, that, as they like to call him, making $100,000, plus he was sassy.
Yeah, but of course, remember at that time, for the audience, $100,000 doesn't seem like a lot, but for that time, $100,000 was equivalent to $10 million.
It was a tremendous amount of money at that time, and it made and Wilt was a very great investor, and it made him a very wealthy man, and of course, the next athlete to crack the 100,000 mark was Bill Russell, and when he was negotiating his contract, he said, I just want to make $1 more than Wilt. You know, so all of these things, when you put it in a sort of a frame, and you hang it on the wall, and you see this money that black athletes are making, and then you have sports writers who are not making a lot of money, and they got to cover these black guys, and it causes problems within themselves.
Do you really? That's an interesting point. I often think of that. Do you really think that explicitly they believe that, or it's an implicit thing that comes from the relationship between whites and blacks in America? For example, many white sports writers would say, or other sports writers would say, that the behaviors of the black athletes, some of their negative behaviors, give them a reason to cover them, give them a reason to criticize them. Now, is that a rationalization, or is it just a function of the way in which people view race in a society?
I'll give you a good example, and this has nothing to do with an athlete. The incident that Janet Jackson had at the Super Bowl halftime show 2 years ago. The stadium was all the lights were turned off, and all.
You could barely see her because if
you couldn't see anything. The stage was black, and all you saw was a spotlight. Now, when they said that her breast was uncovered, I still could not find anyone who saw this. But the person who saw it was some technician who saw it, and he alerted the news people and all. The thing about that incident is that if you watch and read the tabloids in this city and other cities, you will see, especially the tabloids in this city, pictures of virtually naked women in color throughout their paper. And 2 days after this Janet Jackson incident, they ran a picture of a woman who was virtually naked. But yet, she is still being castigated for this. Every time they talk about her, they mention this. So it's just not the black athlete, it is other black performers also. And she admitted that it was a mistake and an error. But black athletes don't get a free pass in the press. This guy, Terrell Owens, what has this guy done except run his mouth?
He did a couple of things that were showboaty. Like,
well, they all
like,
showboat.
Yeah, right.
You know, I mean, they all showboat.
But again, let's just talk about how we can get more positive coverage of African American athletes. Is it a function of having more African American sports journalists? Is it a function of helping the world to understand that it is unfair the way in which athletes are treated? Or is it just a function of understanding the role of sports in this society as a business and entertainment mechanism?
Well, it starts at the top, and it starts in the editorial departments. Who's the sports editor? Who's the executive sports editor? What does the publisher, how does he reflect? Does he pick up that sports page and say, I want you to attack this guy, and the guy happens to be black? Well, the story I wrote a couple of weeks ago, before this latest episode with Jeremy Shockey, do you in your wildest mind believe that if a black athlete called his coach an a-hole, that he would survive? Do you believe in your right mind that a black athlete could do what he did last week and still be a member of the team, especially with a conservative team like the Giants? That is the greatest reflection that I can, and the greatest comparison that I can come with of how the press treats what a black athlete does and what a white athlete does. And Jeremy Shockey is a startling example of that. There's not a black athlete in America who could get away with what he's done and the behavior that he's committed with this team.
Well, given those realities, what can we do to train more African American sports journalists so that they can get in there and say some of the things that you're saying? Bill Rhoden just wrote the book, $40 Million Slaves, which was pretty well respected and received, and he talked about the plantation mentality of many of the sports teams. Well, we need a lot more people like the Bill Rhodens and the Howie Evanses. How do we get them?
Well, there's a sports plantation at the newspapers, and it's not just in sports. It's throughout the.
Well, how do we break that? What are some things we can do to break that?
I don't think it's going to happen in our lifetime, because while we make a lot of money, I'm talking about black athletes, they create millionaires and all, but they don't own anything. And the major problem in this country is that blacks do not do what their white counterparts do, and that is, you got $100 million to spend, I got $100 million. Let's come together and create this. You never ever see black athletes doing that, coming together and creating that. Are we going to have a NBA franchise or an NFL franchise? Well, we got Bob Johnson down at Bed who bought a franchise because he wrote a check for $320 million. But the NBA's wanted Magic Johnson and Michael for years to be part of ownership.
Why don't they?
But do you think that...
Why don't they?
Because they all want to be sole owners and all, you see. So with a team of Michael Jordan and Magic Johnson would be dynamite.
They could be the Yankees of basketball, right?
You see?
Yeah.
But it's not going to happen, because their thinking is totally different than the other guys.
Well, is it so much that their thinking is totally different, or the traditions? Remember, business in this country has been people working together. Even in the Civil War, the North and the South were working together. It's some education that we have to do. But you did say one thing, it wasn't going to happen in our lifetime. I read the other day that the oldest professional baseball player was a black guy who played in 1910. He's 110 years old, and he lived to see Jackie Robinson play. So I think we may not live to be 110, but I think things are going to change, and I think they're going to be changed by awareness. Whenever you have a problem, you have to bring awareness. And what you're doing, what we're doing, what Bill Rhoden is doing, what Mike Wilburn is doing, what we're increasing awareness. Now, sometimes we do it in a way that gets criticized. On the other hand, you got to keep speaking out. So, do you do much with young African American sports journalists to help them to feel that they can speak out?
Oh yeah, all the time. Even with the guys on my staff, I have some fine writers, Marcus Henry and Jamie Harris, who are fine writers, and sometimes I'm kind of protective of them because I'm not sure that they would want to spend their years in the trenches like I have, because times have changed. And my thing now is preparing them and getting them to move into mainstream journalism and all. And,
well, you certainly have provided the leadership and the skill in these years at the Amsterdam News. And what you said today about the challenges that face African Americans in all fields still remains. Today on African American Legends, we've been talking with Howie Evans, the sports writer of the New York Amsterdam News. Thanks for being with us today, Howie.
Thank you. Enjoyed it, Doc.